Chapter 25. It was, Booster Terrick thought, about as chaotic aboard the errant venture as he'd ever seen it. And considering this was the errant venture he was talking about, that was really saying something. They were all over the place. New Republic techs and workers and officer types, thousands of them, crawling around every corner of his Star Destroyer. Fixing things, adding things, taking things out, upgrading things, and occasionally changing things around just for the fun of it. His own people had been overridden, nudged aside, superseded, or flat out run over as this oversized rancor of a restoration crew lumbered through his ship. And moving around the center of it, like the single calm spot in the middle of a circle storm, was General Bella Bliss. 5 more warships arrived in the system last night, a harried looking aide was saying, hurrying to keep up with Bella Bliss as the general strode briskly along the starboard 16 weapon emplacement corridor. Booster, with his longer legs, had less of a problem in that department. Still, in his opinion, Bella Bliss had a lot more energy than anyone had any business having this early in the morning. The Freedom's Fury, Spirit of Mindor, Starline Warrior, Stellar Sentinel, and Welling's Revenge. Good, Bella Bliss said before stepping beside the turbolaser monitor panel. What about the Garfin and Beldine, too? No word on them yet, sir, the aide said, checking his data pad. I've also heard rumors that the Webleys here, but so far they haven't checked in. They're here, Booster spoke up. Captain Wigger is, anyway. Those mechanical fingers of hers leave pretty distinctive marks on metal ale tubes. The aide's eyes darkened. All incoming ships are supposed to check in immediately. It's all right, Bella Bliss calmed him. Don't worry. They'll surface in plenty of time. Alex probably just wanted their crew to get some rest before the orders started flying. They're not the only ones who could use some rest, Booster muttered under his breath. Bella Bliss frowned slightly, as if only now noticing the big man's presence. Was there something you wanted, Terrick? He asked. Just wondering when the work on my ship will be finished, Booster said. We're almost there, Bella Bliss said. Lieutenant? Looks like the major refitting will be completed inside of 12 hours, the younger man confirmed, studying his data pad. There may be a few odds and ends left, but they can be finished on the way to Yaga Minor. Bella Bliss looked at Booster. Was there anything else? He asked. Yeah, there was, Booster said. He stopped, looking significantly at the aide. Bella Bliss took the hint. Lieutenant, go check on the number 7 tractor beam emplacement, he said. Make sure the balance adjustments are being made properly. Yes, sir, the aide said. Throwing a speculative look at Booster, he headed at a quick walk down the corridor. Why don't we step in here out of the way, Bella Bliss suggested, crossing to a door with the bright red markings of an emergency med station. They went inside. Up to now, you've been pretty quiet about what your plan is for this little raid, Booster said, when the door was sealed again behind them. I think it's about time I heard some details. There's not much to tell, Bella Bliss said. We'll be taking the errant venture in past their sentry line and hopefully through their main defense perimeter. Once we're inside, the rest of the task force will come in behind us from hyperspace and attack the perimeter. If we're lucky, the Imperials will be so busy with them that they won't give us a second look. That assumes their first look doesn't pin us to the wall, of course, Booster pointed out darkly. Assuming that, what then? Yaga Minor has a peculiarity that, as far as I know, is unique among Imperial installations, Bella Bliss said. There are a pair of Outrider computer stations set up at the end of the corridor walkway tube that extends about 100 meters out from the main orbiting Ubictorate station. Booster frowned. Odd design. The idea was to give high-ranking civilian researchers access to the computer record system without having to let them into the Ubictorate base proper, Bella Bliss told him. Grand Moff Tarkin ran a lot of his more private stuff through Yaga Minor, and he didn't want his political enemies getting even a glimpse of what he was up to. Okay, so there's a convenient remote connection to the computer, Booster said. I don't suppose it happens to have an equally convenient access hatchway where we can get to it. There are hatchways, but unfortunately they're not at all convenient, Bella Bliss said, his voice turning grim. We'll probably have to blast a hole in the side of the walkway tube and send in our slicers and vac suits. Booster snorted. Right. Blow a hole in the side of the station. That'll sure go unnoticed. It could, Bella Bliss said. The main force will be firing barrages of proton torpedoes at the time. The Imperials may assume that was one of that got through. And if they don't? Bella Bliss shrugged. Then you and I and the rest of the Air Adventures crew start earning our pay the hard way. We'll have to hold them off long enough for the slicers to pull up a copy of the Kamas document and transmit it out to the attacking ships. Booster snorted again. No offense, General, but that has to be the worst plan I've ever heard in my life. What happens to us once we've got the document? Bella Bliss looked him straight in the eye. What happens to us doesn't matter, he said bluntly. If they accept our surrender, fine. If not, then turn the errant venture into scrap around us. Hold it a second, Booster said, frowning. Buried in among all that breathtakingly lousy strategy, he'd suddenly noticed a highly important word. What do you mean, us? I thought you were going to be out there with the main fleet. Bella Bliss shook his head. This ship is the key to the operation, he said quietly. This is the ship that has to survive long enough to first get the Kamas document and then punch it out through whatever jamming the Imperials have going. This is where I'm needed the most, so this is where I'll be. Now wait just one mad mucking minute, Booster growled, pulling himself up to his full 1.9 height. This is my ship. You told me I would still be your captain. You're still the captain, Bella Bliss agreed. I'm simply the admiral. Booster let out a long, hissing breath. He should have known Bella Bliss hadn't really given in on anything. He should have known it. And if I refuse to give you up command? Bella Bliss lifted his eyebrows slightly. Booster nodded, a sour taste in his mouth. With the Air Adventure crawling with Bella Bliss's people, the question wasn't even worth answering. Right, he muttered. I knew I'd regret this. You can stay here if you want, Bella Bliss offered. I'm sure Coruscant would compensate you for... Forget it, Booster bit out. This is my ship and you're not taking it into combat without me. Period. Bella Bliss smiled faintly. I understand, he said. Believe me, I understand. Was there anything else? No, that ought to do it about for now, Booster said glumly. You might want to see if you can come up with a better plan in the next 3 days. I'll try, Bella Bliss promised. Turning, he headed for the door. Wait a second, Booster said, as a new thought struck him. You say we're going to blow a hole in that Outrider computer station. What happens if someone's in there at the time? I'm not expecting anyone to be there, Bella Bliss told him. I doubt it's used much anymore. Besides, I can't see any other way to do this. But what if there is someone, Booster persisted. You said yourself the place was only used by civilians. You blew a hole in the wall and you're going to kill them. A shadow seemed to cross Bella Bliss's face. Yes, he said quietly. I know. Well, Cliff said, consulting his chrono, it's been 4 hours. What do you think? Another 2 before the panic call comes? Navett shrugged, running through a quick mental calculation of his own. He and Cliff had been conspicuously elsewhere at the time, just in case backchecks were made, but according to Penson, the subtle transfer of their little organic time bombs to the Bothan tech's clothing had gone as smooth as spun gem web. 4 hours now since those techs had vanished into the Drevstar and Shield generator building. Give them another hour to make their presence known, 2 more after that for the Bothans to become fully aware of the magnitude of the problem and to exhaust all of the possibilities for dealing with it. I'm guessing at least 3, he told Cliff. They aren't going to be in a hurry to call in off-worlders. Well, the stuff's ready, whatever they do, Cliff said with a shrug. Across the shop, the annoyingly cheery chime rang out as the door swung open. Settling his face into what Cliff had dubbed their earnest but stupid expression, he looked up and felt the expression freeze across his face. There, walking into the shop, were their 2 new rep military types. Beside him, Cliff made a faint choking sound in the back of his throat. Quiet, Navett murmured, adding a slightly dopey smile to his expression and bounding eagerly around the end of the counter towards their visitors. A day of fun and profit to you, or however that goes, he said, keying his voice to the pleasant yet vaguely pushy tone of a merchant determined to make a sale. Can I help you? Just looking, thanks, one of the men said as they wandered down the row of cages. They were two of a kind, Navett noted. Both somewhat short, both with slightly graying brown hair, the speaker with brown eyes while his companion had green. And seen up close, brown eyes especially looked familiar. Sure, sure, Navett said, hovering nearby in traditional shopkeeper style. Anything special you're looking for? Not really, Green Eyes put in, gazing down into the Pulpian cage. What are these? Pulpians? Sure are, Navett said. Both of them had faint Corellian accents, too. You know your pet stock. I know a little, Green Eyes said, gazing at him with a glint in his eye that Navett didn't care for at all. I thought Bothans are allergic to Pulpians. Yeah, some of 'em are, I suppose, Navett said with a shrug. And yet you brought them to Bothawui. Navett put on a bewildered expression. Well, sure, he said, trying to sound slightly wounded. Just because some people are allergic to something doesn't mean someone else won't want to buy it. Not all Bothans are allergic to 'em either. And anyway, there are lots more people here than just Bothans. He broke off as Brown Eyes sneezed. There, see? He said, jabbing a finger towards the other as if the sneeze was sort of a vindication. Probably something in here that he's allergic to, too. But you still came in, right? And I'll bet I can find something that'll make a really great pet for you. The door chime sounded again, and Navett turned to see a thin old woman come in. The fringe companion Cliff had mentioned? Hi there, he said, nodding to her. A day of fun and profit to you. Can I help you? I hope so, she said. You have any ratter thirsts? Navett felt his throat tighten. What in blazes was a ratter thirst? Don't think I've ever heard of him, he said carefully, knowing better than to pretend knowledge he didn't have. I can check the lists, though, see if we can get 'em from somewhere. What kind of critter are they? They're not all that popular, really, the woman said. Her voice was casual, but she was watching him as closely as Green Eyes was. They're small and agile, with tan striped fur and retractable claws. They're sometimes used as livestock border guards in mountainous terrain. Oh, sure, Cliff called from the far side of the counter. Leaning casually on it, there was no sign of the datapad he undoubtedly had going out of sight under the flat surface. You're talking about Cordulian Chris's. Oh, Cordulian Chris's, Navett said, with a knowing nod. He'd never heard of those either, but Cliff's cue was obvious. Sure, I just never heard of him by that other name before. Cliff, can we get him in? Let me check, Cliff said, making a show of pulling the datapad up onto the counter and pretending to turn it on. What are these? Brown Eyes called. He was standing over the Mokrin tank, looking in with a somewhat leery expression. Baby Mokrins, Navett told him, stepping to his side and looking fondly down through the clear plastic at the tiny lizards scrabbling restlessly around on top of each other. Just whelped this morning. Cute, huh? Adorable, Brown Eyes said, not sounding like he meant it. Here it is, Cliff called. Cordulian Chris's. Let's see. There was a beep from Navett's comlink. Excuse me, he said, pulling out the instrument, a sudden feeling of dread coming over him. If this was the call they were expecting. Hello? Is this proprietor Navett of the Exoticalia Pet Emporium? A stiff but harried-sounding Bothan voice asked. Sure is, Navett said, striving for earnest but stupid cheerfulness. It was the call, all right, and with all the rotten luck it had come with a pair of new rep agents standing right there listening. What can I do for you? We have a small but troublesome insect infestation problem, the Bothan said. Our attempts to eliminate them have so far proved futile. As a dealer in exotic animals, it was thought you might have some suggestions. Probably, Navett said. Cliff and I did some bug squash work before we got into the pet business. What kind are they? They're unfamiliar to our experts, the other said, sounding disgusted. All we know is that they're very small, do not respond to any of our extermination methods, and at random intervals all begin making a loud humming noise. Could be scrunkies, Navett suggested doubtfully. They make a pretty annoying noise. Or afrins, or... Wait a minute. I'll bet they're metal mites. You got any electronics or heavy machinery in the area? There was a sort of strangled sound from the comlink. A considerable amount of it, yes, the Bothan said. What do metal mites do? Chew through metal, Navett said. Of course, they don't actually chew through the stuff. They've got enzymes that. I don't need the physiological details, the Bothan cut him off. How do we eliminate them? Well, let's see, Navett said, rubbing his chin thoughtfully for the benefit of the new rep agents. Green Eyes had that glint in his eyes again. First thing you gotta do is some spraying. You got any, let's see, any Cortrican around? That's Cordelian Transicol if you need the whole name. I don't know, the Bothan said, but I'm sure we could get some made up. Before you do, make sure you got someone who knows what they're doing, Navett warned. Won't do you a bit of good to just slather the stuff around. There was a brief pause. What do you mean? I mean, you can't just slather the stuff around, that's what, Navett said, letting a little impatience creep into his voice. You gotta get all the spots where they're going to feed, but also leave them enough bare spots. He sighed. Look, this isn't something for amateurs to mess around with. We've got the equipment to spray with. We use them to disinfect our cages in stock. You get us the Cortrahan, and Cliff and me can do the job for you. Impossible, the Botham said sharply. Off-worlders cannot be permitted in that area. Oh, okay. Navett shrugged. He'd expected the automatic rejection of his first offer. Just trying to help. You'll have plenty of time to get rid of a single brood before it does much damage. He frowned as if something had suddenly occurred to him. It is just a single brood, isn't it? When they hum, do they all make one note, or are there a couple of different pitches? There was a short pause. There are several different notes, the Bothan said. 5, perhaps 6. Navett let out a low whistle. 5 of them? Oh boy. Hey, Cliff, they got 5 different broods in there. Well, good luck to you. I sure hope you can get someone on them before the brood war starts. He keyed off the comlink. 5 broods, he murmured, shaking his head. Wow. Shocking, Green Eyes agreed, the glint still in his eyes. Pretty exotic pests, metal mites. They come in on ships sometimes, Navett said, wishing he could read that face. Green Eyes was suspicious, all right. But was he suspicious of Navett personally, or just the general metal mite situation? I've heard of 'em riding Minox, too. Sort of scavenging along behind as they. There was another beep from the comlink. Excuse me again, he said, pulling it out. Hello? This is Field Controller Trishibia again, the same Bothan voice came, sounding disgusted. I spoke with you a few moments ago. Yeah, sure, Navett said. What can I do for you? I've been instructed to ask how much you would charge for getting rid of the metal mites, Trebia said. Oh, not much, Navett said, carefully suppressing a smile. From the tone of Trebia's voice, it was clear the sudden official change of heart wasn't his idea. Matter of fact, as long as you spring for the Cortrahan. Well, look, the guys at Customs says we're going to need a special merchant's license to sell our pets outside Drevstar. You get us that license, and we'll do it for free. For free, Trebia repeated, the pitch of his voice dropping a few steps. Why so generous? Listen, I've seen what metal mites can do, Navett said stiffly. If you think I want to run a business in a town where they've gotten a foothold, you can think again. And the faster we get started, the easier it'll be to get rid of them. You get us a merchant's license and the juice, and we'll call it even. I believe that can be arranged, Trebia said reluctantly. You and your equipment will have to submit to a full scan before you can be allowed into the facility. No problem, Navett said. Actually, this'll be kind of fun. Just like old times. When do you want us? A land speeder will pick you up in 30 minutes, the Bothan said. He still didn't sound happy, but there was a cautious note of relief in his voice. Be ready to go. We will, Navett promised. The Bothan clicked off without bothering to say goodbye. Man, you just never do know, do you? Navett said philosophically, sliding the comlink away. Sorry, folks. Did you want us to order some of those Chris's for you, ma'am? Cliff, you find anything on the lists? Looks like we could get them from a supplier on Islow. Have them here in 2 or 3 days, Cliff reported. Or we can get them shipped in straight from the Cordu itself. That'll probably be a little cheaper, but it'll take longer. You want to order today? Navett asked hopefully. You only have to put up a tenth down on front. The old woman shook her head. I think I'll see if anyone else in town has them in stock first. Well, if you don't find anyone, come on back, Cliff called as the 3 of them headed for the door. We could get express service for a pretty reasonable fee. We'll keep that in mind, Brown Eyes promised. Thanks. We may be back. They filed out, passing across the front window and out of Navett's view as the door closed behind them. I'll just bet you will, he said softly to himself. He shook his head, dismissing them from his mind. Fringe lifters and even new rep agents were completely unimportant right now. What was important was that their little metal mite time bombs, introduced into the shield generator tech's clothing, had done their job. And now it was time for Cliff and him to do theirs. Let's get ready, he said, heading briskly towards the back room. Mustn't keep the Bothans waiting. And here, General Hestive said, keying a combination into the keypad, is where you'll be working. Okay, Gent said, glancing nervously down the long corridor behind them. It was a long way back to the main house, and Hestive had assured him that hardly anyone ever came out here anymore. But there was a whole Imperial Ubictorate station back there, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched by unfriendly eyes. With a puff of slightly stale air, the door swung open. There we go, Hestive said, gesturing him forward. Go on in. Gent stepped into the doorway, throwing Hestive a sideways glance as he passed. Admiral Pellion had vouched for him, he knew, but the man was still an Imperial officer, and Gent was from the New Republic. If this Moff Disra person wanted to do away with him, this would be a perfect place to do it. And then he got his first glimpse of the room itself. This is your new temporary home, Hestive said from behind him. What do you think? Gent hardly heard him. Could hardly believe his eyes, for that matter, as he looked around the tiny room. Crammed into it were an Everest 448 data sifter, a pair of Fedukowski DS-squared decrypt decipherers, 5 Wickstrom K220 heavy-duty peripheral processors, a Marilang 1221 full-spectrum numerical analyzer. The equipment's probably nothing like what you're used to, Hestive said apologetically, but hopefully it'll do. And there, as a centerpiece, nothing less than a brand new Rickhouse Masterline 70 Oct terminal. A Masterline 70? No, not really, Gent managed, still staring goggle-eyed at the shining array. And they were going to let him have this whole room? All to himself? But it'll do just fine. Good, Hestive said, crossing the room in front of him and keying open another door Gent hadn't yet noticed. Your living quarters are in here, so you won't have to leave this section at all. In fact, you might want to change the coding on the door lock after I leave so that no one can even accidentally walk in on you. Sure, Gent said, his nervousness about this place already forgotten. I can seal it up real tight. Okay if I get started? Whenever you're ready, Hestive said. Dimly, Gent was aware the other was staring at him oddly. You know how to get hold of me if you need anything. Good luck. Sure, Gent said, as Hestive stepped back through the doorway. There was another puff of air, and Gent was alone. Dropping his carry pack on the floor, he shoved it with his foot to the general direction of the living area. Imperial moths, lurking danger, and even imminent civil wars all but forgotten. He pulled out the chair in front of the Masterline 70 and sat down. This was going to be fun. It took an entire hour of scans and examinations under the watchful eyes and ungentle hands of what seemed to Navett to be half of Drevstarn's contingent of Bothawui security. But at last, with the obvious reluctance of a being who heartily dislikes a situation but has no better alternatives available, Field Controller Trebea finally led him and Cliff down into the lower levels of the shield generator building, into the very center of the Drevstarn defense system. Impressive stuff, Navett commented to his glowering guards as he glanced casually around the room. I can see why you want to get rid of him fast. He hoisted the tank of Kortrahan a little higher on his shoulder. Okay, he said, waggling his slender sprayer loosely in his hand. First thing is for you to show me anything really delicate or critical you don't want them getting into. We don't want them getting into any of it, Trebea snapped, his fur rippling. Yeah, sure thing, Navett soothed. I just meant where do you want us to start spraying? We should do the most delicate stuff first. Trebea's fur rippled again. I suppose that seems reasonable, he said unhappily. Clearly, the last thing he wanted to do was point out the most important parts of their precious shield generator to a couple of humans. This way. Not that it mattered, of course. Navett knew perfectly well what everything in this complex was, and neither he nor Cliff needed the Bothans to point out the kill points to them. But it was something an earnest but stupid pet shop owner might be expected to ask. Besides, he was curious to see how honest the Bothans might get in the middle of a crisis like this. You may start there, Trebea said, stopping and pointing to a completely non-vital backup comm console. Okay, Navett said. Apparently, not very. They'd been spraying for 15 minutes, laying out the elaborate curlicue chemical trails that were the only way to effectively kill metal mites, when things finally began to get interesting. This one next, Trivia said, laying a hand protectively on the edge of one of the consoles responsible for maintaining the power frequency coupling between the various poles of the planetary shield. Right, Navett said, his heart starting to beat faster as he stepped over to the console. This was it. The first blade thrust into the heart of the species whose actions had cost the Empire so much over the years. The Bothan techs had already removed the access panels. Shifting his grip subtly on the sprayer as he crouched down, Navit eased the tip into the maze of electronics and gave it a delicate squirt. Only this time, he left more than just the metal mite killing Crotcher hand to bend up on the circuit cards and drip slowly down into the power supplies and ventilation fan casings below. This time, his new grip had allowed the slender tank built into the sprayer handle to dribble some of its own special contents into the mix. The hour-long examination of the Bothans had put their equipment through had scanned for everything those paranoid minds could have thought of. Weapons, spy equipment, explosives, poisons, soporifics, acids, wire spinners, and probably 50 other potential threats. But nowhere in all those multiple layers of precautions had anyone thought to program a check for food. Not that anyone in the generator building would have found this particular brew even remotely appetizing, not even the metal bites. In fact, now that the rotten little vermin had played their part, it was time for them to die. He and Cliff spent the next 2 hours moving systematically through the complex, laying down their poison trails and at perhaps 20 carefully selected points, adding in a squirt of their liquid nutrient. By the time they finished, the thick, sweet, sour smell of the Cortrahan was almost like a physical barrier that had to be pushed aside as they walked through it. Okay, Navett said cheerfully as they were finally escorted back into the security entrance area. First step's done. Now all you gotta do is put a loudspeaker on that's blasting out the brew's different carrier pitches. That keeps them from talking back and forth inside their groups, and that keeps them from breeding faster so they can fight with the other brews. Gives the Cortrahan time to work. You see? Yes, Trebea said, looking marginally less unhappy now that the off-worlders were no longer in direct contact with his precious machinery. How long will this be necessary? Oh, we gotta do it, Navett said. 8 or 9 days just to be on the safe side. Some broods are harder to kill than others. Don't worry, though. They won't be eating anything during any of that. Mostly, they'll just be dying. Very well, Trebea said reluctantly. I have only one more question, then. I am told these pests are quite rare. How is it that they were able to find their way in here? Navit shrugged as casually as he could. The groundwork had been laid, but that didn't mean that they were out of the snake pit yet. If the Bothans decided to be suspicious enough to go back in and clean out everything he and Cliff had just laid down, this whole setup would have been for nothing. You got me, he said. You bring any new equipment in here in the past week or two? The Bothan's fur rippled uncertainly. There were 2 pieces of equipment that arrived 7 days ago, but both were scanned thoroughly before they were brought in. Yeah, but I'll bet your scanners aren't programmed for heavily metal-based life like these things, Navit pointed out. It was a safe bet. Certainly the Bothan scanners hadn't spotted the little beasts riding in on their incoming tech's clothing. Tell you the truth, I don't know if anyone really knows where they come from or how they get around. They just pop up now and then and make trouble. They probably came in with that equipment, though. You might want to catch a couple of them and use them to reprogram your scanners so they can't make any more trouble. Thank you, Trebea said, a little huffily. Apparently, Bothans of his stature were not used to having the obvious pointed out to them. No problem, Navit said cheerfully. Earnest but stupid. He was the type to take everything at full face value without noticing any undertones. Glad we could help. And you'll get that merchant's license for us, right? I will do what I can to help with it, Trebea said. which was, Navett noticed, not precisely what he'd originally promised. But that was all right. In 6 days, if all went according to plan, Trebia would cease to exist, along with the city of Drevstarn and as much of the rest of Bothawui as the Imperial Star Destroyers hidden out there could manage. And on that day, Navit planned to look down on the shattered world from one of those Star Destroyers and laugh. But for now, all he needed to do was smile. Great, he said cheerfully. Thanks a lot. And if you guys ever need anything, just give us a call. He and Cliff didn't say anything to each other on the ride back to the pet shop, nor did they speak once they were there, at least not about anything of substance, until they'd gone over each other thoroughly with the spy mic detector hidden in the bottom of the doppelfly cage. But if Trebia didn't especially like them, he apparently wasn't overly suspicious of them either. The spy scan came up clean. Sloppy, Cliff grunted as they returned the detector back to its hiding place. You'd think they'd at least want to hear us slapping each other on the back about getting our license so cheap. I'm sure they back-checked our records before they called us in, Navett said, sniffing in disgust as he slapped at his shirt. That blasted Corcher hand stuck to everything. Did you get a chance to see where our power conduit came into the building? I never got to that side of the building. I saw it, Cliff nodded. They've actually got a splice going off one of the power cables, probably ready to go to the new equipment Trebia mentioned. But they hadn't opened the wall any? Cliff shook his head. They're not that stupid. No, the whole wall's still there. Fine, Navett said, shrugging. It would have been handy to have had some of that meter-thick reinforced, heavily braced, multiple-layered, impenetrable wall out of their way, but it certainly wasn't necessary. I'm just worried about it taking another 6 days before we can spring this, Cliff continued. Won't the stuff we left start to deteriorate? Not a problem, Navett assured him. The tricky part now is going to be digging down to the power conduit from that Hodin place and then cutting through it without setting off sensors from here to Odivstrarn. You think they've wired the conduit itself? I would if I were in charge, Navett said. Horvik and Penson can get us into the lower place after hours, but we won't have much time each night to work. Slow and steady is the way to go, and 6 days should be just about right. I suppose, Cliff said, sobering. Of course, that assumes we even have 6 more days. Or have you finally decided to do something about those new rep agents? Abruptly, he snapped his fingers. Oh, blast! I just made that face. Wedge Antilles. You're right, Navett said, grimacing as the name belatedly clicked with Brown Eye's face. General Wedge Antilles, leader of that multi-cursed rogue squadron. A single insignificant group of X-Wings that had probably caused the Empire more trouble than all the Bothans in the galaxy put together. And that's going to make things that much more awkward. Even without New Republic celebrities involved, a triple murder would create a major fuss. He let his eyes drift around the shop, taking in the rows of cages, the subtle mix of smells and sounds. Surely Antilles wouldn't see any threat in the harmless pet shop. But no, they'd been standing right here when the call came through, and knew he and Cliff had been invited into the shield generator building. No, they'd have the pet shop marked now, for sure. But I don't suppose we can afford to let them poke around anymore either, he conceded. I guess it's time we took 'em out. Now you're talking, Cliff said, with dark approval. You want me to take care of it? Navett cocked an eyebrow. What, all by yourself? Hey, they're just X-Wing jocks, Cliff said. At least Antilles is. Outside their cockpits, they're babes in arms. Maybe, Navett said. But they found us okay. And that old woman looks like she knows her way around, too. Meaning? Navett gave him a tight smile. Meaning you don't take them out by yourself, he said. We'll do it together. Miranda sipped at her blue-green liqueur. I don't know, she said, shaking her head. I can't say that any of them really leaped up and waved at me. That's one way to put it, Wedge said sourly, massaging his aching temples with thumb and middle finger. 50 different shops, businesses, service spots, and eating establishments. All of them set up in Drevstarn since the warships began gathering overhead. All of them visited personally by him, Corin, and Miranda in the past 4 days. The business turnover rate on Bothawui must be astronomical. Another way is just to admit that we've hit another dead end. I'm not sure I'd go quite that far, Corin said slowly, meditatively swirling his drink around on its glass. There were a couple of places that were definitely more on edge than others. That Mashaki jewelry owner, for one. Stolen goods dealer, Miranda dismissed him with a flip of her hand. And he spotted us right off as anything but casual customers, by the way. You've really got to learn how to rein in that straight back to Corsac stance of yours, Corin. And that Hodin Tap Cafe, Corin continued, ignoring her as he ran a finger down their list. It's sitting right on top of one of the power cable conduits to the generator building. And has been there for 10 years, Miranda reminded him. Except that the day manager mentioned they'd just hired a couple of humans for the late cleanup shift, remember? Corin countered. There's something about that bothers me. Wedge eyed him over his cup. Corin, he knew, had never had much luck with the mind-reading aspects of the Force, not like Luke or Leia. But if he couldn't retrieve other people's thoughts, he could still pull out impressions and hints and textures. Combined with his old Corsac detective training, it meant that anything that bothered him was worth taking a hard look at. And then, of course, Corin added, there are our friends at the Exoticalia Pet Emporium. Wedge looked at Miranda, waiting for her rebuttal, but it didn't come. There's them, all right, she said instead, frowning down at the tabletop. I don't like that one at all. I thought you said none of them had jumped out at you, Wedge reminded her. No, they didn't, Miranda agreed. That's just the point. The pet guys acted just perfect. But how many pet shop owners do you know who also happen to be experts at getting rid of vermin, and exotic ones like metal mites yet? We should be able to back-check them and see if that kind of experience shows up in their records, Corin said. But he didn't look any happier than Miranda did. I just wish we knew where exactly this metal mite invasion had taken place. Has to be someplace with really high security, Wedge said. They weren't even going to let him in at first. And at the same time, that decision got overruled real quick, Miranda said, nodding. Someplace with ultra-high security, but yet extremely sensitive and vital. For a moment, the three of them looked at each other. Corin broke the silence first. It's the shield generator building, he said. There's nothing else in Drevstarn that fits. Agreed, Miranda said, sipping at her drink. Question now is, was the metal mite incursion the attack or the bait? If it's the attack... She broke off at a muffled beep from Wedge's comlink, buried deep in the pocket of his jacket. Who knows you're here? She asked. Our shuttle, Wedge told her, digging out the instrument. We set up a relay for any incoming transmissions. Thumbing it on, he keyed for low volume. Go Red 2, he gave the code word. The message was very short. This is Father, Bella Bliss's familiar voice said. All is forgiven. Come on home. Wedge squeezed the comlink hard. Acknowledged, he said. On our way. He keyed the comlink off and looked up to find Corin's gaze hard on him. Dad? Wedge nodded. Dad, he confirmed. Time to go home. Meaning, Miranda asked. Meaning we have to leave, Wedge told her. Right now. Oh, that's convenient, Miranda growled, glaring at him. What about the shield generator? From now on, the Bothans are on their own, Wedge said, draining his drink and sorting out coins onto the table. I'm sorry, but we were only on temporary loan anyway. Miranda grimaced but nodded. I understand, she said. Well, it was fun while it lasted. You should probably give Bothan Security a call, Wedge said, standing up. Point them to our friends at the pet shop. Whatever, Miranda said, waving a hand. Happy flights. Thanks, Wedge said. Come on, Corin. Just a second, Corin said. He hadn't moved from his chair, and there was a glint in his eyes as he looked at Miranda. I want to know what Miranda's going to do now. Oh, go on, she chided him, making little shooing motions with her hands. I'll be fine. In other words, you're going to stay on this, he said bluntly. She lifted her eyebrows. That's very good. Corsac teach you how to do that? You haven't answered the question, Wedge said, sitting back down again. You are going to call security, aren't you? And tell them what, she countered. We don't have a scrap of proof. It's worse than that, really. They presumably already did a back check on Navett and his buddy, and they still let them into the generator building. So what are you going to do? Wedge persisted. Stay on this by yourself? Miranda's mouth set itself into hard lines. I was given an assignment, Wedge, she said quietly. I'm supposed to stay here and watch for vengeance attempts against Bothawui. Corin shook his head. That's not a good idea, he said. If vengeance is being driven or guided by Imperials. So where are you two off to? Miranda demanded scornfully. A vacation on the beaches of Birchest. I'll lay you 50 to 1 it'll be a lot more dangerous wherever you're going than anything I'm likely to run into here. Miranda, Wedge began. Besides which, you don't have time to argue about it, she cut him off. If Dad is who I think he is, he's not going to be happy if you two get home late. Now scoot, both of you. Thanks for all the drinks. Reluctantly, Wedge stood up again. She was right, of course, and she was certainly more than old enough to make this kind of decision for herself. But that didn't mean he had to like it. Come on, Corin. Miranda, you watch yourself, okay? You too, she said, smiling up at him. Don't worry about me. I'll be just fine. That's the end of the chapter. Hope you liked it. Talk to you soon.